He raised his right hand in a Manhattan courtroom and swore to bury her. He had rehearsed every word for weeks. Stephanie St. Clair had anticipated every word for months. The jury needed 7 minutes. The clock on the east wall of Manhattan's General Sessions Court read 9:47 in the morning when the bailiff called the name. November 14, 1938. The courtroom smelled of old wood, coal heat, and the particular brand of institutional silence that settles over rooms where people's fates are decided by strangers. Rain had been falling since before first light, and the tall windows along the far wall were streaked a deep pewter gray, the kind of mourning that made everything inside feel enclosed, deliberate, final. The gallery was full. That much was noted by 3 separate newspaper reporters seated in the second row. They had come expecting spectacle. What they found instead was stillness. Not the stillness of a room waiting to hear something surprising, but the stillness of a room that already understood the weight of what was about to happen and had chosen to hold its breath anyway. At the defense table, Stephanie St. Clair sat with the posture of a woman who had never once in her life been made to feel small by a room, and who had no intention of beginning now. She wore charcoal gray wool, a single strand of pearls and low-heeled court shoes of dark leather. Her coat was folded across the back of her chair. Her hands rested on the table, still. Before her lay a closed notepad and a fountain pen she had not yet opened. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the prosecutor. She did not look at the jury, who had been watching her since they filed in at 9:15 with the studied neutrality of 12 people trying not to appear as though they had already formed an opinion. She looked at the witness stand. The prosecutor, a trim man named Harold Feeney who had spent the previous afternoon reviewing his notes with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he already knew how Tuesday would end, rose from his chair and smoothed the front of his jacket. He had a case built, he believed, on the testimony of someone who had been present. Someone who had seen, heard, and could testify with authority to events that the prosecution needed the jury to understand in a particular way. He called his witness. The man who walked to the stand was not large. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed the walk as well as the words, shoulders set, gaze directed toward the front of the room rather than the gallery. He did not look at Stephanie. That was, in itself, a form of information. The bailiff extended the Bible. The man placed his right hand upon it. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. He sat. He smoothed his trousers. He placed both hands on the railing of the witness stand and looked at Harold Feeney with the expression of a man ready to deliver what he had promised. Stephanie St. Clair watched him for precisely 3 seconds. Then she looked down at her closed notepad. She did not open it. She did not need to. Every document that mattered had been reviewed so many times over the preceding 3 months that the relevant passages had long since committed themselves to memory. Dates, figures, contradictions, the precise gap between what this man would claim and what the record could prove. The notepad was closed because there was nothing left to write. The prosecutor cleared his throat and began. Please state your name and your relationship to the defendant. From the second row of the gallery, one of the reporters noted in his pad, defendant shows no reaction. Composed. Watching. What the reporter did not write, because there was no language in his vocabulary for it, no framework that allowed him to see it clearly in that room, on that morning, in that year, was that composure of that quality, in a woman like Stephanie St. Clair, in a courtroom like this one, was not the absence of something. It was the presence of everything. She had been building her answer since the day she realized the question was coming. Martinique. The island was French in name and colonial in fact. A place where the language of empire moved freely through the markets and the courts and the churches, but never quite reached the lives of the people who cleaned those churches, stocked those markets, and stood outside those courts waiting to be told what their labor was worth. Stephanie St. Clair was born into that particular arithmetic. A girl on a French Caribbean island who understood, before she had the words to name it, that the distance between the people who owned things and the people who were owned by circumstance was not fixed. It was a gap. And gaps, if you studied them long enough, had edges you could grip. She studied everything. She was 26 years old when she arrived at New York Harbor on a gray September morning in 1912, carrying $30, 2 dresses, and a fluency in French that the city had no immediate use for. The harbor smelled of brine and engine oil and the dense, indifferent press of 1,000 arrivals who each believed, in varying degrees of desperation, that they had come to the right place. Stephanie stepped onto the dock and looked at the skyline the way she had always looked at problems, without flinching, and without rushing to a conclusion she hadn't yet earned. She had no connections in New York. No family waiting. No arrangements made. What she had was a capacity for calculation that she had been sharpening since childhood, and the particular kind of patience that comes not from ease but from necessity. The first years were domestic work. Hell's Kitchen, primarily, the crowded, steam-heated tenements of the West Side, where Irish families hired black women to clean their kitchens, mind their children, and render themselves invisible by 5 o'clock. The pay was between $5 and $7 a week. The hours were long and the expectations were clear. Arrive before the household woke, leave after it settled, and require nothing in the meantime. Stephanie took the work and said very little and saved more carefully than anyone around her understood was possible on that wage. She moved north when Harlem moved north. By 1916, the neighborhood above 110th Street was already shifting. Black families from the South arriving by the tens of thousands, crowding into blocks that landlords had begun to realize were more profitable when rented at a premium to people who had no other options. The streets of Harlem in those years had the quality of something mid-construction. Jazz drifting from basements on Lenox Avenue, churches filling on Sunday mornings with people who had traveled 1,000 miles to worship without being told to use a different entrance, and on every other corner the quiet hum of an underground economy that the city's legal institutions had never once offered to replace. It was on those corners that Stephanie first encountered the numbers. The system was not complicated. Each morning, a number was drawn, derived from the daily pari-mutuel totals at a racetrack, a figure that no single person could control or predict. A player placed a bet as little as a penny on a 3-digit combination. If their number came in, the payout was $6 on the penny, a 600-to-1 return that no bank in New York would ever offer to a black working family, because no bank in New York was in the business of offering anything at all to a black working family. The numbers were not glamorous. They were practical. They were, for a significant portion of Harlem's population in the 1910s and 1920s, the only financial instrument that acknowledged their existence. Stephanie understood this immediately. Not as opportunity alone but as obligation. Whoever controlled the numbers controlled something essential. She began to watch how the operation moved, who collected, who banked, who kept the books, where the money went when trouble came. She watched for 3 years before she moved. In 1923, at the age of 37, Stephanie St. Clair became a numbers banker. She invested $10,000, accumulated over 11 years of domestic wages, small loans called in, and a series of smaller bets on her own judgment that had, without exception, paid out. She entered the business not as a runner, not as a collector, but at the top, as the person who held the money, absorbed the risk, and set the terms. Within 6 months, 2 established bankers on the west side of her territory had either consolidated with her or moved their operations south of 110th Street, away from the quiet certainty of her presence. She was not violent. She was not loud. She did not need to be either. What she was, and what the men who underestimated her consistently failed to account for, was prepared. Her ledgers were meticulous. Her knowledge of every runner, every collector, every police precinct captain who accepted payments and everyone who did not was recorded in files she kept in the mahogany desk of her apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, where she had lived since 1921 and where the bookshelves held French novels alongside American legal codes she had taught herself to read. By the late 1920s, her territory ran from 110th Street to 145th Street, from Lenox Avenue to 5th Avenue, 37 city blocks, 43 runners, 3 collectors, 2 accountants, and monthly revenues that fluctuated between $35,000 and $45,000 depending on the season. She employed Ellsworth Johnson, known on Harlem streets as Bumpy, as her primary enforcer. He worked for her. The distinction mattered, and she maintained it without ambiguity. She paid her runners promptly, on time, every week without exception. When a runner's mother fell ill on 133rd Street in the winter of 1927, Stephanie covered the doctor's bill and 2 months of rent and said nothing about it publicly. When a competitor attempted to muscle one of her collection points on 128th Street in 1928, she did not send Bumpy. She sent a letter to the competitor's landlord, who happened to owe Stephanie a considerable favor, and the collection point was undisturbed by the following Tuesday. In 1929, when the 32nd Precinct began a systematic campaign of shakedowns against her runners, uniformed officers showing up at collection points, pocketing cash, and threatening arrests that were never filed because they were never real, Stephanie placed a full quarter-page advertisement in the New York-Amsterdam News, listing badge numbers, dates, and amounts. The police commissioner's office received 14 letters of complaint within a week. The shakedown stopped within 2. She purchased a .32 caliber revolver in 1924 and kept it in the left-hand drawer of her desk, beneath a folder of bank records. By 1938, she had never fired it outside of practice. She had never needed to. This was the empire the courtroom in November 1938 was trying to dismantle. 26 years of discipline, sacrifice, community trust, and absolute precision, built by a woman who had arrived in this country with $30 and a Martinique accent and not a single institution willing to extend her anything resembling a fair exchange. No partner had helped her build it. No partner had stood beside her when the 32nd precinct came. No partner had sat at that mahogany desk through the long winter nights counting receipts and filing evidence and learning the law out of necessity because necessity had always been her primary teacher. The kingdom was hers. It had always been entirely, irrevocably hers. And the man now seated in the witness stand of Manhattan's General Sessions Court had known her only after the walls were already up, the foundations already poured, the territory already held. He had arrived to something built. He had not helped build it. That was the first thing the jury needed to understand. He arrived in Harlem the way certain men always arrived, loudly, and with the absolute conviction that the room had been waiting for him. His name was Sufi Abdul Hamid, born Eugene Brown in Lowell, Massachusetts, though by the time he reached the streets of Upper Manhattan in the early 1930s he had long since buried that name beneath layers of self-invention. The silk turban, the floor-length cape, the booming platform voice that could hold 500 people on a Lenox Avenue corner in February cold and make every one of them feel that what he was saying had been said for them alone. He was a labor organizer, a street preacher of sorts, a man who had made himself a figure of consequence in a neighborhood that recognized consequence when it stood in front of them and demanded attention. He was also, by any fair accounting, a man who had always understood the difference between building something and attaching himself to something already built. Stephanie had observed him for 2 years before their paths formally crossed. She attended no street rallies. She read the coverage in the Amsterdam News with the same methodical attention she applied to police blotters and property records, noting his arguments, his rhetoric, and, with particular interest, the specific language he used when describing the financial arrangements of Harlem's community institutions. He had opinions about where Harlem's money went and who controlled its movement. It was, she recognized, the vocabulary of a man who wanted proximity to capital. They married in 1938. She was 52 years old. He was younger by more than a decade. There is a version of this story that reduces Stephanie St. Clair to the category of woman who could not see what was in front of her. It is the wrong version. Stephanie saw exactly what was in front of her. She had been reading People for 30 years, and the file she kept on Sufi Abdul Hamid, in the same mahogany desk at 409 Edgecombe Avenue where she kept files on corrupt police captains and rival bankers, was begun before the marriage, not after. She was not blind. She was, for reasons she kept to herself, willing. What she could not fully account for was the speed at which his ambitions would clarify. The fracture did not arrive gradually. It arrived on the evening of August 3, 1938, in the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, when a conversation about the disposition of certain accounts that bore her name, her signature, her 15 years of accumulated deposits, became something other than a conversation. He wanted access. Formal access, the kind that required her signature on documents she had not yet reviewed. He presented this as a matter of practical arrangement, a reasonable consolidation between two people who were, after all, now legally bound. The figures he named were specific. He had prepared them in advance. Stephanie listened to him for 4 minutes. Then she asked him one question: whose counsel had drawn up the documents? He did not answer directly. That was answer enough. What followed has been documented in court records, testified to by neighbors on 2 separate floors of the building and reported, with varying degrees of accuracy, in 3 New York newspapers within the week. Sufi Abdul Hamid left the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue that evening with a gunshot wound to the shoulder, non-fatal, administered from the .32 revolver that Stephanie had kept in the left-hand drawer of her desk since 1924 and had, until that night, never discharged outside of practice. She did not flee. She did not call anyone to help her construct a story. She called the police herself, gave her name and address and waited. The charges filed against Stephanie St. Clair on August 4, 1938, were felonious assault with intent to do bodily harm. The prosecution's theory, as it would be presented in court, was straightforward. A woman had shot a man. The man was willing to testify. The woman had a documented history of operating outside the law. The conclusion, in the prosecutor's estimation, was not complicated. What the prosecution had, and what it believed was sufficient, was the testimony of the injured party. Sufi Abdul Hamid had been present. He had been wounded. He could describe the evening in the sequence that served the state's argument. The argument, the threat, the shot, the injury. A man's account of his own wounding, delivered under oath, was a powerful instrument in any courtroom in 1938. More powerful still when the person who had fired the weapon was a black Caribbean immigrant woman whose livelihood had never once received the protection of the institutions now preparing to judge her. The New York Daily Mirror ran 3 paragraphs on the story on August 6, beneath the headline, "Harlem Numbers Queen Shoots Husband." It did not mention self-defense. It did not mention the documents he had brought to the apartment. It mentioned the revolver, the wound, the arrest, and her known association with Harlem's illegal lottery operation. That was the framing the prosecution intended to carry into court, not a story of 2 people in a disputed marriage, but a story of a criminal woman and a wounded man and the violence that lived, inevitably, in that world. Stephanie read the Mirror piece at her kitchen table on the morning of August 7. She read it twice. Then she set it aside and opened a fresh ledger page. She had known, from the evening of the 3rd, that the next chapter of this situation would be decided not in that apartment but in a courtroom. She had known it because she had lived long enough in New York to understand how the machinery worked, how a black woman's account of her own actions became, the moment it entered the legal system, a story told primarily by other people, in language she had not chosen, toward conclusions that served purposes she had not set. She had known it and she had begun preparing accordingly. The first entry on the new ledger page was dated August 7, 1938, at 7:14 in the morning. It read, "Witnesses. Documents. Sequence of events. His counsel, find out who." 3 months before a Manhattan courtroom would hear the case, Stephanie St. Clair had already begun building the answer. The first thing Stephanie St. Clair did after the police left 409 Edgecombe Avenue on the evening of August 3, 1938, was sit back down at her desk. Not to compose herself. She was already composed. She sat down because there was work to begin, and the sooner it began, the better position she would be when the work became necessary. She opened the fresh ledger she had started that morning and wrote the date at the top of the first page in her precise, unhurried hand. Then she wrote 4 words beneath it, "Understand what they have." That was the discipline. Not anger. Not fear. Not the particular kind of humiliation that the evening's events might have licensed in almost anyone else. Just the question that mattered most at the start of any engagement. What did the other side actually possess and where were its weaknesses? She had 3 months to find out. She did not waste a single day of them. On August 10, 1938, Stephanie retained Raymond West, one of a small number of black attorneys then practicing criminal defense in Manhattan, a man she had known by reputation for 7 years and had specifically never needed until now. West operated from an office on 125th Street, 2 flights above a tailor's shop, in a suite of rooms that were unimpressive to look at and formidably organized within. He was methodical, unhurried, and held the rare quality of listening to a client without filling the silence with reassurance. Their first meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Stephanie arrived with a folder. Inside, a timeline of the evening of August 3, written in her own hand, beginning at 6:15 and ending at 9:42. A description of the documents Sufi Abdul Hamid had brought to the apartment. The names of 2 individuals she believed had knowledge of those documents' origin. And a single handwritten note at the bottom of the last page that read, "The shot was fired after a threat was made. The threat can be substantiated." West read the folder without speaking. When he finished, he looked up and said the question that mattered, "How much of this can you prove?" Stephanie opened a second folder. The prosecution's theory was not complicated, and its simplicity was what made it dangerous. A man had been shot. The woman who had shot him was in the room. The man was willing to testify. In the legal architecture of 1938 New York, that was frequently sufficient, particularly when the woman in question was black, Caribbean-born, and known to the court records of 3 precincts as the operator of an illegal lottery enterprise. The prosecutor, Harold Feeney, was not a man who expected complications. He had a witness. He had a wound. He had a record. What he did not have, and what Stephanie spent the following weeks methodically ensuring he would never have, was the version of the evening that held together under scrutiny. She began with the precinct. Through a contact she had maintained at the 28th precinct since 1931, a records clerk named Dolores, whose sister's family Stephanie had assisted through the worst winter of 1934, she obtained, through entirely proper channels, the responding officer's initial report filed on the night of August 3. She read it at her kitchen table the morning it arrived, a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and underlined 3 sentences in pencil. The report described the scene as it was found. It described the position of the discharged revolver. It described the location of the wound, left shoulder, posterior aspect, consistent with a man turning away from the source of the shot. Consistent, in other words, with a man who had been moving. Not standing still. Not advancing. Moving. She set the report beside the timeline she had written on the night of the 3rd. The two documents agreed in every material particular. The account Sufi Abdul Hamid had given to the responding officers, that he had been standing still, that the shot had been unprovoked, that no documents had been present, agreed with neither. She underlined that too. The witnesses came in stages. The first was Mrs. Cora Hines, who occupied the apartment directly below Stephanie's on Edgecombe Avenue and who had been present in her own kitchen when the argument began through the floor above her. Mrs. Hines was 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Virginia who had lived in the building since 1929 and who, when Stephanie visited her on August 14, produced from her own memory a sequence of events that matched Stephanie's timeline with a precision that required no coaching. A man's voice raised. A woman's voice measured. A silence. A single sound. Then the woman's voice again, calm, speaking to someone on the telephone. The second witness was Mr. Thomas Reeves, a postal worker on the 4th floor who had passed Sufi Abdul Hamid in the building's lobby earlier that evening and could attest, under oath, to the specific leather document case the man had been carrying. A case that had not, according to either the police report or Sufi's own initial account, been mentioned at all. Stephanie noted both names in her ledger on the day each conversation concluded. Beside each name she wrote a single word: reliable. The documents themselves were the third layer. The financial papers Sufi Abdul Hamid had brought to the apartment on the evening of August 3 had been left behind when he departed. Stephanie had not touched them after the police arrived. She had pointed to them. The responding officers had apparently not considered them relevant to a shooting and had not catalogued them in the initial report, an oversight that Stephanie had anticipated and that Raymond West, when informed of it, recognized immediately as both a procedural failure on the prosecution's part and a substantial piece of evidence for the defense. The documents were examined by West on August 22. They were, precisely as Stephanie had described, a proposed transfer of signature authority over 3 accounts bearing her name, drafted by a law firm with no previous professional relationship to Stephanie, prepared without her knowledge or consultation, and requiring her signature to take effect. The law firm's name was on the letterhead. The date of preparation, July 28, 1938, 6 days before the evening in question, was stamped in the upper right corner. West filed those documents with the court on September 4. The prosecution received copies the following morning. Harold Feeney's confidence, from that point forward, became a more complicated instrument. There was a night in late September, the 23rd, a Thursday, the rain coming in hard off the Hudson, when Stephanie sat at the mahogany desk at 11:30 and allowed herself, for the first and only recorded time in those 3 months, a moment that was not strategic. She had been reviewing the final witness statements. The folder was complete. The contradictions were documented. The legal argument was assembled. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. And yet she was 52 years old, alone in an apartment in a city that had never once extended her a formal protection, facing a courtroom that would seat 12 strangers in judgment of her life. And the man who had sat across this desk and spoken of arrangements and accounts and practical consolidations was going to raise his right hand in a room full of people and present himself as the injured party, as the victim, as the one who deserved the protection of the law. She sat with that for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she closed the folder, straightened the stack of papers and went to bed. By morning she was back at the desk. The work resumed. By mid-October, the preparation had reached its final architecture. Raymond West had identified a 4th witness, Dr. Anson Pruitt, the physician who had treated the wound at Harlem Hospital on the evening of August 3 and whose clinical notes on the wound's location and trajectory were in direct contradiction to Sufi Abdul Hamid's stated account of the shooting's circumstances. West had secured Dr. Pruitt's availability for November 14. He had also filed a formal motion requesting that the financial documents be admitted as evidence of provocation, a motion the prosecution opposed and the court ultimately allowed. By November 1, Stephanie had reviewed every piece of the assembled defense 3 separate times. She had walked West through the sequence of the evening so many times that he could recite it in the correct order without notes. She had identified, in Sufi Abdul Hamid's account as reported to police, for specific claims that her witnesses and physical evidence directly contradicted. Not approximately contradicted. Directly. She had not attempted to build a case that was better than his. She had built a case that was true, and then, with the same precision she had applied to her numbers ledgers for 15 years, She had documented its truth so thoroughly, so specifically, so systematically, that there was no version of the courtroom on November 14 in which his testimony survived intact. The courtroom, she had always understood, was simply another territory. It had pressure points. It had leverage. It had boundaries that could be mapped in advance and exploited with patience. She had mapped every inch of it. She was ready. Harold Feeney rose at 10 past 10 on the morning of November 14, 1938, and addressed the jury with the measured confidence of a man who believed the next 2 hours would confirm what he had already decided 3 months prior. His opening was not complicated because, in his estimation, it did not need to be. He told the jury what they were going to hear. He told them who they were going to hear it from. He told them that a man had been shot in his own home. He used the phrase his own home deliberately twice, and that the woman who had fired the weapon was seated at the defense table to his left. He did not look at Stephanie when he said it. She did not look at him. She was watching the jury. She had been watching them since 9:15 when they filed in. 12 faces. Expressions arranged into careful neutrality. She had studied faces across negotiating tables and police precinct desks and church vestibules for 26 years, and she had read this jury's collective disposition in the first 4 minutes of the morning with the same method she applied to every other room she had ever needed to understand, not by looking for what people showed, but by noting what they worked to conceal. They were uncertain. That was useful. Uncertain juries decided based on evidence, not assumption. She opened her notepad for the first time. Sufi Abdul Hamid took the stand at 10:23. He wore a dark suit, no turban, no cape, nothing of the platform persona that had made him a figure of consequence on Lenox Avenue corners. He had chosen, deliberately, the appearance of a private man. A husband. A wounded party seeking the plain protection of the law. He settled into the witness chair with the unhurried composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times, and when Harold Feeney began his direct examination, Sufi Abdul Hamid answered each question in the calm, measured cadence of a prepared witness performing restraint. His account of August 3 was this. He had visited the apartment at Edgecombe Avenue to discuss a financial matter of mutual concern. The conversation had been calm initially, then disagreeable. At no point had he raised his voice. At no point had he threatened the defendant. He had been standing still, he said with emphasis, when the shot was fired, without warning, without provocation, with what he described as cold deliberateness. He had left the apartment under his own power, found a telephone, and called for assistance. He had done nothing wrong. He was asking only that the law recognize that. Feeney thanked him. He rested his direct examination at 10:51. He returned to his seat with the posture of a man expecting applause. Raymond West stood without urgency. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to a position approximately 6 feet from the witness stand, close enough to be precise, far enough to give the jury an unobstructed view of both men, and he looked at Sufi Abdul Hamid for a moment that lasted just long enough to communicate that what was about to happen had been prepared for a very long time. He began quietly. Not with the shooting. With the documents. On the evening of August 3, did you carry a leather document case into the apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue? Pause. I don't recall a document case. Mr. Reeves. Thomas Reeves, postal worker, 4th floor resident of 409 Edgecombe Avenue, took the stand at 11:04. His testimony lasted 9 minutes. He described the lobby of the building on the evening of August 3, the time he had passed through it, the man he had seen crossing toward the elevator, and the dark leather document case the man had been carrying in his left hand. He described the case's size, its clasp, the way it had been held. He had not been asked to prepare those details. He had simply remembered them correctly because they had happened. Sufi Abdul Hamid, recalled briefly, amended his account. He believed now that he may have had papers with him. Business documents. Nothing significant. West produced Exhibit A for the defense. The financial transfer documents, dated July 28, 1938. Prepared by a law firm with no prior relationship to the defendant. Requiring her signature alone. He placed them on the railing of the witness stand and waited. Mrs. Cora Hines took the stand at 11:22. She was 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and she gave her testimony in the precise, unhurried cadence of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching children the value of saying exactly what they meant. She described what she had heard through the ceiling of her apartment on the evening of August 3. A man's voice, elevated, sustained. A woman's voice, steady, lower in register. A silence of perhaps 2 minutes. A single sharp report. Then the woman's voice again, speaking into a telephone, giving an address. The woman's voice, West asked. After the shot, how would you describe it? Mrs. Hines considered. Controlled, she said. Like she had decided what to do next. Dr. Anson Pruitt testified at 11:41. He was the attending physician at Harlem Hospital on the night of August 3, 1938, and he had treated the gunshot wound sustained by Sufi Abdul Hamid. He described the wound's location, left shoulder, posterior aspect, in the clinical, specific language of a man whose profession required precision above all else. He explained, when West asked him, what the wound's position indicated about the relative position of the shooter and the subject at the moment of discharge. The wound was consistent with a subject in motion, turning, moving away from the source. It was not consistent with a man standing still. It was not consistent, in any reading of the physical evidence available, with the account Sufi Abdul Hamid had given to the responding officers on the night of August 3, or the account he had given again under oath on the stand that morning. Feeney's cross-examination of Dr. Pruitt lasted 4 minutes. It changed nothing. Raymond West's closing argument ran to 11 pages. He delivered it in 40 minutes at a tempo that never rose above the conversational, in the tone of a man presenting arithmetic rather than argument, because by that point arithmetic was all that was required. He walked the jury through 4 specific claims the prosecution's witness had made and 4 specific pieces of evidence that directly contradicted each one. He asked no rhetorical questions. He expressed no outrage. He simply placed the documented truth beside the sworn testimony and allowed the distance between them to speak at its own volume. He sat down at 1:47 in the afternoon. The jury retired at 2:03. Stephanie sat at the defense table while the room rearranged itself around the act of waiting. Raymond West organized his papers. A court reporter buffed a smudge from her machine. Harold Feeney spoke in low tones with his junior colleague, his posture carrying for the first time that day the particular quality of a man revising his expectations downward. And in the gallery, packed since morning, held in by the November cold outside and the weight of what was happening within, not a sound. Stephanie looked down at her notepad. At the top of the page she had written, in the first hour of the morning, a single line. She read it once. Then she closed the notepad, set it on the table, and folded her hands over it and sat very still and allowed herself, in the privacy of her own expression, something that was not quite certainty and not quite fear, the narrow human strip of land between what you have prepared and what you cannot control, the place where all careful people must eventually stand and wait. She had stood in that place before. She knew how to hold it. At 2:10 in the afternoon the jury door opened. 7 minutes. The foreman was a heavy-set man in a brown suit who read from the verdict form without inflection. The court went perfectly, completely quiet. On the charge of felonious assault with intent to do bodily harm, not guilty. Raymond West set his pen down. In the gallery, a sound moved through the room like a breath finally released after hours of being held. Harold Feeney gathered his papers with the careful movements of a man performing composure. Stephanie St. Clair did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she reached for her notepad, placed it in her bag, lifted her coat from the back of the chair and stood. She did not look at Sufi Abdul Hamid, who was already leaving. She did not look at Feeney. She did not look at the gallery, though she knew it was full of faces she recognized, people who had ridden the streetcar down from Harlem that morning because the verdict in this room mattered to them as much as it mattered to her. She put on her coat. She buttoned it, 1, 2, 3, lifted her bag, nodded once to Raymond West, and walked toward the courtroom doors at the same measured pace with which she had entered that morning. Outside, the November light was thin and pale over Center Street. She walked into it without pausing, without looking back, her footsteps steady on the stone steps. She had always known this was the only possible outcome. She had simply done the work to make it true. There were perhaps 40 people on the steps and pavement outside Manhattan's General Sessions Court on the afternoon of November 14, 1938, when Stephanie St. Clair walked through the doors and into the thin winter light. They had come from Harlem on the streetcar. Some had been there since morning. They stood in their good coats, collars turned against the November cold, and when the doors opened they did not cheer. They did not call out. They simply looked at her, and she looked back at them, and something passed between them that required no translation. The particular recognition that moves between people who have shared a long siege and watched it end the only way it was ever going to end. She nodded once. They understood. The New York-Amsterdam News ran the verdict on its front page the following Thursday beneath a headline that was precise and brief. Madame St. Clair acquitted. Samuel Ransom, the paper's editor, had covered Stephanie's affairs for nearly a decade. Her 1929 campaign against precinct shakedowns, her running battle with the syndicate through the early 30s, the steady, unglamorous work of protecting a community that the city's official institutions had declined to protect. He gave the acquittal 4 paragraphs. The fourth noted, without elaboration, that the jury had deliberated for 7 minutes. That number traveled through Harlem the way significant numbers always traveled. Quietly, precisely, by word of mouth, each repetition carrying the same weight. 7 minutes. Not an hour. Not a morning. 7 minutes, meaning the jury had walked into that room, looked at one another, and found that there was, in the end, nothing to discuss. Sufi Abdul Hamid's public standing, already complicated by years of contested rhetoric and shifting allegiances, did not recover from the witness stand. His testimony had been specific, confident, and wrong on 4 documented points: the document case, the wound's trajectory, the sequence of events attested to by a retired schoolteacher through a ceiling, the financial papers dated 6 days before the incident in question. A man who swears under oath to facts that 3 independent witnesses and a physician's clinical record directly contradict does not simply lose a case. He loses the credibility that a public life requires. Harlem, which had always conducted its own accounting of who kept their word and who did not, made its assessment without ceremony and moved on. Stephanie returned to 409 Edgecombe Avenue on the afternoon of November 14 and sat at the mahogany desk by the window as the light went down over the Harlem River. The ledger was open. The fountain pen was uncapped. She wrote 2 lines. The date. The outcome. Then she closed the ledger, went to the kitchen, and made coffee. The numbers operation resumed its regular rhythms. 43 runners on 37 city blocks. Collections on schedule. Accounts settled on Fridays. Families whose rent she had quietly covered through the worst months of 1937 and 1938 continued to receive what they needed without announcement or condition. The community did not owe her gratitude and she did not ask for it. The arrangement was simpler than that. She was there as she had always been there, and the neighborhood knew it. The courtroom on Center Street was the last major institutional battle of her active career, but it was not the first. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1935, Dutch Schultz, who had spent 2 years consolidating control over Harlem's numbers territory through levels of violence Stephanie had always refused to meet on equal terms, was shot and killed in a Newark restaurant. When the news reached Harlem, Stephanie sent a telegram to the city authorities. It read, "I always knew God was on my side." 4 newspapers reprinted it. Nobody found it amusing. By the late 1940s, Harlem had changed in the ways that cities change when forces larger than any single person reshape the architecture of power. The numbers racket, which had sustained tens of thousands of families through the Depression years, was gradually absorbed by structures she had not built and could not control. She withdrew from the business by degrees, not in defeat, but in the manner of a woman who understood the difference between the end of an enterprise and the end of her own significance. She died on December 1, 1969 in New York City, 57 years after stepping off a boat at the harbor with $30 and 2 dresses and a set of calculations already forming in her mind about what this place was and what it was going to cost her and what she intended to do about that. She had built an empire. Defended it with documents and newspaper advertisements and filed evidence and 4 witnesses who told the truth in a room that had been designed to make the truth difficult to hear. She had outlasted syndicates and corrupt police captains and a partner who raised his right hand and swore to destroy her. She had done all of it without once becoming what the city expected her to be, diminished, frightened, grateful for whatever portion of justice happened to fall in her direction. What the courtroom could not take was the thing she had carried since Martinique. The understanding, absolute and unshakable, that the gap between what was done to you and what you did next was the only territory that ever truly belonged to you. She had held that territory without concession for 83 years. She was right to.